Sarah Davey.
And I'm James Routledge.
And this is Books Unpacked.
Join us as we chat to people from across the publishing industry to unpack the life cycle of a book.
Pop the kettle on, get comfy, and we'll get started.
Sam, hello. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
No, it's all right. I mean, we were chatting before we pressed record a little bit about the sort of serendipity of putting a call out into the world, especially on Twitter, and how nice it is to get so many people raising their hands and saying, yeah, I'm up for a chat. So this is kind of how that came about, right?
Yeah, we do love a natter, don't we? I think it's very appropriate that you found me on Twitter as well, because obviously I think a lot of people know me from my Twitter presence. And, some people think I do nothing apart from tweet, but, I occasionally do some work as well in between. But yes, no, I'm really glad I found you at that particular moment, basically.
Well, we are definitely interested in the work you're doing at the minute. We're interested in the whole kind of social media world that you're tackling and that you're kind of helping people navigate. And obviously the empowered author is a big part of that. And more recently, Meet the Booktokers, which we're really excited to talk about. But if you could just give us a little bit of an introduction about yourself and what you're up to.
Brilliant, thank you. Yes, so my background is actually originally in magazines. So I always worked in consumer magazines, sometimes business to business, but ultimately usually based around an interest or a hobbyist magazine. So it might have been books about gardening or photography. What else have I worked on? Books about cars, pregnancy, weddings, and I always worked in circulation and subscription strategies. So what that actually gave me was a sort of basis in understanding how people with hobbies behaved. So we obviously see this in the book industry, that people behave in a certain way when they have a hobby or an interest in something. So I went from working in magazines, and then the Bookseller magazine, who I happened to know the boss because I'd worked with him on other magazines, he said, "Do you want to come and work for the Bookseller?" I had obviously never heard of it. And, when I worked, I then realized I had some author friends, and I was like, I've got this job on this magazine called the Bookseller. And they're like, "Oh my God, that's so cool." Cool is obviously a relative thing when we're in publishing. This is what I realized. But so I started working on circulation and subscription strategies for the Bookseller. I happened to start working there in 2009, which is when the sort of digital transformation of the industry really took a kind of pace. So that was when, at the time, there was a thing called a Sony e-reader, which preceded the Kindle. Then obviously Amazon came along and sort of obviously innovated all over the space, in particular, obviously, ebooks, and kind of opened up a whole kind of new market, but also opened up a lot of threat and risk and fear among publishers. But the exciting thing from a person who likes innovation and had also sort of fallen in love with the book industry at the time, I was kind of like, oh, great, this is like where my two sort of interests will kind of collide. So I launched something called Future Book while I was there, which is still going, thank goodness, which is a big conference, but also it was a community site where we sort of charted what was going on. So it's all kind of quite exciting from a sort of journalistic point of view, because, obviously the book industry doesn't have lots of rapid change. It's not that sort of industry. So to have this innovation was an exciting moment. And it was really exciting to see how publishers and really everybody responded to it. So I worked at the Bookseller doing that for 5 years. And then I sort of very randomly decided that I wanted to work at HarperCollins, and a new boss came on board, a guy called Charlie Redmayne, who I had known from working at Future Book. And I sort of forced him to give me a job because I thought, well, maybe I could do publishing, even though I knew very little in terms of, obviously I'd not come from a book background. I'd not come from a book publishing background. And he very generously gave me a job I'm in the corp comms department running author events. So my job there, which I have to say is probably one of the best remits of a job I think you could have in publishing, which is come up with ideas for events with authors, but also across our entire list. So you can imagine how big the publishing list is for HarperCollins, 200 years worth of publishing, but also you obviously have, Lord of the Rings, Dr. Seuss, Paddington Bear, Mills and Boons, fantastic sci-fi and fantasy. So it was basically come up with creative ideas of how we can pull readers towards us, which is exactly what I love to do, which is not necessarily book marketing, so a book just sort of marketing one book at a time, which is how the industry works, but coming up with ways that we can kind of pull people towards us because we have this amazing sort of, I don't want to say content because that's a horrible word to sort of use with books, but amazing authors, amazing history, amazing kind of book covers, everything that sort of also goes with publishing. So I worked there for a few years and I did quite a lot of really interesting projects there. And then I had a sort of massive mental health breakdown just through the sort of stress of having this very high flying job, but also being a single mum and commuting and blah, blah, blah. So I then left and decided, sort of seeing how the industry had gone, I decided that I would, I sort of saw some gaps basically. And one of them was the fact that because of the digital transformation, we were then seeing obviously this whole new thing of self-published authors, which had obviously started taking off and started really professionalizing itself as a sort of community. But ultimately, authors were publishing, but didn't know an awful lot about marketing. And at the same time, we were seeing traditionally published authors who, obviously, there's a sort of massive kind of hierarchy of authors in terms of, obviously, if you're a debut author, you will have a certain amount of energy and time and resource put into you. And then, obviously, if you're a massive kind of A-list author, you have a very different experience, a different budget. So that it meant that there was a whole raft of authors who basically didn't get very much marketing for their books. And obviously, because social media was also taking off, it was kind of like, okay, well, you actually have the opportunity to do a lot of this yourself, but it involved learning a lot of new skills. So I launched the Empowered Author to sort of fit into that space of empowering authors to, with their careers, but mostly about marketing. So I've been running that for, I don't really know how many years now, but quite a few, nearly 10 probably. And to be honest, obviously authors have learned loads of skills in that time, and obviously some authors are absolutely exceptional at marketing, but there are still tons of authors entering the industry who are going through the same experience, whether they're traditionally published or self-published, which is kind of like, okay, I've written a book, oh, what do I do now? And then recently I started, I sort of decided to go onto TikTok, so it's about 2 years ago now. Because obviously I had been seeing all these sort of reports and everything about BookTok being this incredible community on TikTok, which is ultimately driving massive numbers of book sales, which, ultimately, I guess, as a industry person, if you're not excited by the bit that is driving people into bookshops and driving book sales, then there's something wrong. Do you know what I mean? It's like we cannot ignore something that we know categorically is driving people into bookshops and categorically driving book sales. So I went onto TikTok, obviously made some absolutely horrendous videos of my own, like a sort of big old boomer, sort of turning up at a young person's party, but really was there to kind of observe how BookTok worked, and also to observe the industry, how authors use TikTok and how publishers were using TikTok. So in sort of very brief terms, I noticed that BookTok is a massive community, insanely huge, bigger than I could ever imagine. And I keep trying to think, what number would I put to it in terms of how many BookTokers are on there? And I think, I sort of started thinking maybe there are 10,000. Now I think maybe there are like 50,000 to 100,000, maybe even more than that, an incredible amount. Obviously, of all relative size and different genres they like, and they talk in different ways about books. But I also noticed that apart from a few publishers who were really good at it, in fact, Harper is one of the publishers who is excellent at TikTok, and obviously some authors who are excellent, relatively speaking, not many are using TikTok that well. Mm-hmm. So I thought, okay, how can I kind of create a community that can showcase BookTokers with authors and publishers and allow them sort of put their books into those BookTokers' hands without having to create loads of content on TikTok, which ultimately lots of people don't want to do. Mm-hmm. So that's it. So Meet the BookTokers it fills that space. It's been going for about 3 weeks and it's going really well. I say that with sort of quite surprise in my voice, but it's going very well. And it's confirmed exactly what I thought, that gap did need to be bridged, basically. So I'm really excited about it.
So that's the thing with TikTok. So I've used it to like look at recipes and exercises and posted some videos, and then was like, nah, I can't. Like, it takes a lot of work to create the content. We've been talking about where I'm working at the moment, and we've said you need someone full time. Like, we've got to think about what have we actually got to say? What have we got to put on there? You know, it doesn't happen in a vacuum, you
No.
know. And so why do you think BookTok has been so successful along the lines of, you know, all the other things that are on TikTok, like the recipes and the exercise? Why do you think it's worked so well?
Yeah, I think BookTok has worked so well. Well, I think some of it started because of the pandemic. So I think a lot of people went on to TikTok. This is my understanding after talking to a few BookTokers. A lot of them started then. And because it was a fairly young platform then, I think a lot of them got success really quickly. Now, in terms of building your audience, you can still, even now, so however many years it's been going, you can still grow your audience significantly quicker on BookTok than you can on TikTok, quicker than you can anywhere else. So you see kind of results quicker, which is obviously a lot more satisfying. I'm sort of using, you know, I've never really used Instagram very successfully. I love taking photos. So actually, you know, in the main, my Instagram feed is like a photo of a dog that I look after once every sort of 6 weeks.
Yeah,
Then maybe of a flower. Do you know what I mean? It's like I'm not an Uber user of that. And my account over 15 years probably, I still only have a few thousand followers. Do you know what I mean? It's like it hasn't grown that much. Whereas on TikTok, I've been there 18 months, hardly really used it. I've made a handful of things that I already have twice as many followers as that, and loads more engagement. So I think there's an element of it being more satisfying, but I think also, so we went in terms of social media, obviously we've talked about books on Twitter for a long time and talked about the industry. In fact, that was one of the things that really interested me at the start. But I think the nature of how the platform works, obviously to start off with, there wasn't even images that you could attach and blah, blah, blah. So I think the nature of that, for whatever reason, doesn't lend itself to really driving lots of sales, even though I do think it does drive some sales, and I think it has lots of tangential benefits for authors, and it's certainly a valuable tool still. I mean, let's ignore all of the awful things that are going on there, but you know, it's still a useful tool in the same way as, say, Threads is or Blue Sky. And then Instagram came along, and obviously that leaned into people who like the aesthetic of books. So I think then, you know, there were just so many beautiful, beautiful Instagram book accounts or Bookstagram that was mostly based on, you know, creating a beautiful visual of your book with, you know, some flowers around or whatever it happens to be in a beautiful corner of your beautiful flat. Or and I think obviously that still happens. I think it's changed a bit because obviously now you have reels and blah, blah, blah. But I think ultimately, you know, I think it's still quite a sort of aesthetic account, you know, aesthetic platform that appeal to a certain type of person. Booktokers are, I would say, people who like to talk about books like this without having to think, oh my God, I need to like aesthetically create something around this book. They like to sort of sit face to camera. Obviously, it's lots of young people, but also actually all ages. And they like to talk about books in lots of different ways. So it might be that they are talking about a book haul that they, you know, they've either just been book shopping or, you know, they want to compare their 6-star book reads. And there is very little aesthetic about it. Do you know what I mean? It's very, I mean, I keep saying the word authentic, but authentic, I think when you're sort of talking to a camera is not authentic ultimately, is it? But it's not kind of curated and filtered. I was with a friend who has no sort of kind of connection with TikTok, and I was showing them Meet the Booktokers, and they said, oh, show me a couple of the really big BookTok accounts. And I took them to a few, and they were like, is that it? Like, they've got millions of likes, millions and millions of likes. But actually, do you know what? They all just sit in front of the camera and say, look, I've got the latest Margaret Atwood, or I've got the latest Sally Rooney. I love this about it, blah, blah, blah. So I suppose in many ways, it's closer to how normal people have interactions about talk about books, which is like, oh, did you like that other Sally Rooney? Well, actually, these are books. If you love, you know, that book, then these are 3 books that you would definitely love. Or, you know, if you love that book, if you watch those films, you know, there's a kind of crossover and a more natural way of talking. And I just think it really works. And it clearly does work because people actually then go, oh, I'm going to buy that. You know, I'm going to buy that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I was just going to say, like, that sort of organic recommendations of books. I mean, you know, if you walk into a really good bookshop on your high street, I mean, that's just normal. That's every day. You're hand selling your kind of favorite titles all the time, and it just becomes natural. And I feel like, especially when, you know, quote unquote this like new technology comes in,
Mm.
and like there's this fear factor, I think, isn't there, of how to embrace something new. And it doesn't necessarily have to not have been around for a long to be new, but if it's new to you,
Yeah,
it's like this like weird trickle down effect with social media. It's like, how long does it need to be out there before your mum picks it up or your
yeah,
gran picks it up?
yeah,
And I feel like lockdown was such a big catalyst for TikTok especially, and everybody, but particularly kids and young adults, really embracing TikTok because it didn't need to be polished. It didn't need to be
exactly.
this perfect product. They could just throw up a video and have a laugh as well,
Mm.
and
Yeah,
make it less formal.
yeah,
And actually that's certainly since lockdown how I think everybody started to see it,
Yeah.
yeah.
and not being scared to say the wrong thing or
No,
to,
exactly. That's
you know,
exactly right. And yeah, it's not a polished finish kind of trailer for a book. That's not what the vibe is. But I think also in terms of, God, well, when you start talking about young people, it's a bit like, ah. But like I have a 23-year-old daughter, and she was obviously on TikTok way, way before I was. She doesn't create any content, but she actually uses TikTok in the way that I actually read an article about it yesterday, as a sort of zone out time.
Yeah.
So, like, if she has what she would consider a stressful day, obviously we're relatively speaking here, that she would then come home and just be like, I need a little bit of time just to go into like a TikTok sort of hole
yeah,
and not come out for like an hour. Do you know what I mean? And
Yeah.
like that's a very sort of, and I don't think like even YouTube was potentially like that, but because they're longer form, I think that it didn't do quite the same thing. Certainly, Twitter doesn't do that for anyone, I don't think, or young people. I don't think you sort of go into a bit of a kind of hole. I mean, you certainly can go into a Twitter hole, but you don't have a nice time. You come
No.
out thinking the world,
yeah,
thinking the world is a terrible place. But I think, like, the weird thing about TikTok as well is that the algorithm is incredibly sophisticated. So when I
Mhm.
first went on there, I sort of started just random, because to start off with, it kind of gives you everything, and but very quickly, obviously, you will click on something that looks of interest, and it works you out incredibly quickly, like on really quite a sophisticated level. So, like, I was having like a bit of a tough time at the time, and I was sort of like talking about depression and different things, and blah blah blah, and it was like giving me all kinds of like, family trauma TikTok. Do you know what I mean? Really kind
Yeah.
of like, how the hell did it work out that? So of course, once you start clicking on book talk, obviously you get delivered tons and tons of brilliant book content. So
Weirdly,
um,
just on the algorithm, because I used TikTok a bit during lockdown, very much like that.
mm,
And I think the algorithm on TikTok gets you more than the algorithm on Instagram. So
yeah,
I look at a lot of exercise things. I'm into climbing and stuff, but
yeah,
I'm not there for the stuff that's like, you need to get thin. I
no,
find that on TikTok, I didn't get that. I got what I wanted and what I
yeah,
needed. And on Instagram now, I go into the feed and I get some nice stuff, but generally I get a lot of stuff I don't want to see. So
yeah,
that interests me a lot as to how they've gotten that to work. Well, I don't understand how it works. It's like magic. It's
no,
terrifying magic, but
yeah,
for me, it definitely worked. But because it's book things, obviously, all over the place. The
yeah,
worked out that I read translated fiction, it was just millions of recommendations. I loved it. Um,
yeah.
but it does work really, really well.
Yeah, it does. It does. And obviously that, is a bit of a sort of ball rolling, which is, once you start thinking, oh, actually, I really would like some recommendations for, books about women of a certain age who, you know what I mean? And then they will start being delivered to you. Do you know what I mean? So obviously then you think, oh, actually, it's really sus me. I will buy those books. So I think, it's kind of, it's certainly as sophisticated as I think we have available currently as a recommendations tool. And I think this is one of the things why I find it quite frustrating. And don't get me wrong, this used to happen on Twitter as well, when people are just like immediately dismissive of TikTok, because it's just stupid people doing dances and blah 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 blah. And it's like, well, yeah, but when I started on Twitter, it was like people taking, sort of talking about the things that they ate or the things that were in their fridge, or you know what I mean, or that they were taking their car to the garage, or it was used in a particular way that perhaps wasn't that interesting, but that's kind of how it started. And TikTok is a lot more sophisticated than it just being about people dancing. And if you're only getting TikToks with people dancing, that's because that's what you're interacting with. I think Matt, a lot of I think like a few sort of US senators were saying, oh, all I ever see on TikTok are girls in their bikinis doing, and it's like, oh,
oh dear, don't say that out loud.
It's funny though. I mean, sounds like what you were saying before. It's about, you don't know how many people are on these platforms until you start looking, and that, once you start finding the content for you, and in this case, whether that's book recommendations or maybe hearing from authors, hearing from readers or whatever, even bookshops now obviously really picking up on BookTok. The more you look, the more you find, right?
yeah.
So, I mean, in your experience then, how have you found the engagement changing, or the type of engagement with BookTok changing since you've started having these conversations with publishers? You obviously saw a bit of a gap in the market and
Yeah.
thought, well, why aren't people embracing this? Or
Yeah.
if they are, maybe they're just not doing the right thing. I mean,
Yeah.
since that conversation started, how have you seen things change?
Well, I think I sort of worked out, because obviously the fact that I'd worked in HarperCollins, I did actually know how sort of departments are structured and how resources are assigned, especially where marketing is concerned. So I worked in a sort of central marketing team, which basically doesn't exist anymore. So my job when I left the events, and then I had a job, and I was called head of audience development. So the difference between audience development and book marketing is what I described earlier, which is about collectively trying to pull people towards you as a publishing company. So that might be you want to do an imprint kind of marketing campaign, or you might want to do a backlist, for a particular author and reintroduce lots of readers. I mean, this happens all the time in publishing. But obviously, the absolute main bit of how publishing works is they publish however many books each week. And as a marketing person, you will work on that, a certain number of books. So you will have a book which is coming out in 3 months' time. It's like, okay, or 6 months or 9 months or a year, depending on how important that book is. And it would be like, come up with your marketing campaign and then go ahead and implement it. Right. So the Sally Rooney book is a really good example, a massive marketing campaign. Obviously, they would have had a number of people put behind that. And obviously, people always think, oh, it must be so nice having all that budget. Well, it is really nice having all that budget, but that means you do loads more things.
Yeah.
And that involves loads more people having to implement those. Do you know what I mean? It's like, yes, it's nice, but actually there's tons of work involved in executing something as good as that. But still, it is book to book to book. Now, Sally Rooney's book came out a couple of weeks ago. Mostly their marketing would have stopped for Sally Rooney now. You know what I mean? Because they've now moved on to their next big favourite book, or 3, 4, 5, 6 favourite books they've got coming out today. Yep. And they need to prioritise that. So the marketing teams are basically set up usually within imprints, where they will focus on the books that are being published in that imprint, and they will work with the publicity teams to make sure the launches work really well and the launches are as successful as possible, because that is obviously the important thing, is to kind of get the algorithms, as in things like Amazon and obviously things like the bookshops getting a lot of buzz early, so that they will say, well, actually everyone is talking about this book, or we've got tons of pre-orders, so let's stock it. You know how the book selling process works. So it is really important. But actually what that means is, if books don't take off straight away, so obviously a lot of books that might be, say, debut or a mid-list author who has a 3rd, 4th, 5th book, if they don't take off for that launch, they're kind of left, and that is a bit disheartening. But anyway, just to go back to what I was saying, so in terms of the resources within publishing, even a big publisher like HarperCollins does not have an endless supply of marketing people by any stretch. They have a limited number, and it's quite shocking how many books individual marketing people work on. It's a huge number. So if you then say, actually, could you create TikTok content for all of that on top of what you're doing already, on top of your campaigns? they probably, well, certainly wouldn't have any time to do it because you do have to learn how to do it. And it takes a bit of time and you've got to follow what the current themes are and the, different trending sounds and all of these sort of things, which in itself takes time. Do you know what? You might not like TikTok. That's another thing that I think is really important because that's actually what I say to authors is, do you actually like TikTok? And if they say no, I say, well, there's literally no point you trying to create content on a platform that you don't like. So either learn to love it or we will think of alternative ways for you to reach audience. But so basically, publishers don't have the resources to do it. That's the upshot. So what happens at HarperCollins, which I think is probably indicative of all publishers who are good on TikTok, is they had one person who really liked TikTok.
Mm-hmm.
That is as basic as that. And they started building an audience. And when they obviously started building an audience, they started seeing results. And then obviously someone said, well, actually, can we allocate a little bit more resource to TikTok specifically? Because actually we're getting results here. And now they've got a sort of team, and I suspect they all work on all different things as well. But they have a team that works on TikTok and other things. But they definitely have put resource behind it because they are seeing results. Most publishers, certainly smaller publishers in the big five, will not have the resource to do that. And I think it's really as simple as that. So that's really sort of I think the reality of why publishers aren't doing it, not because they don't want to do it, not because they don't understand the value of it, they just simply don't have the resource. And I think if they're lucky enough to have one person who is absolutely mad for TikTok, they should just say, actually, do you know what, you just go ahead, create it all, we'll like oversee the first few TikToks that you make and then just go and see how far you can take it, because basically if you're into TikTok, if you work at a Faber or a Bloomsbury or wherever, if you have all of that sort of content at your disposal, if they say just go and create like TikToks based on any of our books, I mean, you would have like literally the best time. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's why they should all be employing Booktokers, is what I would say, is get those people in who are all doing it really quickly because they've been doing it for 5 years or 4 years or whatever. So yeah, I think that's the thinking behind it, but it's not because they don't want to do it. It's not because they don't see it as an opportunity. So when I'm now speaking to them, actually, the kind of main things big publishers are saying to me is we basically spend all of our time trying to find the right Booktokers. And so this is the thing that I'm sort of offering to them, which is when all my Booktokers sign up, they basically, I know where they are geographically by how the sort of back end of the system works. They tell me which genres they like. They click on sort of how many followers they have. They say which languages they read in. They also tell me which hobbies they have. So if we put a real life example of that, if we had a Nigel Slater lovely cookbook coming out, I could actually go in and say Nigel Slater was doing a tour around the UK. I could go in and search for Booktokers in Newcastle who like eating out, who like cookery, who've clicked on food and drink, who might like literary fiction as well, because there's a sort of lit fic crossover with Nigel Slater. And then I could email them in the system and say, Fourth Estate, HarperCollins have invited you to a Nigel Slater event.
Yeah.
Sort of on TikTok, that is basically impossible. It will be impossible to find them.
Looking for a book, if you type in BookToker, well, everything comes up. And when we were just talking about the influence of BookTok in sort of bookshops, the books that tend to be in bookshops under the BookTok thing are one very specific type of book, not necessarily the kind of things we might read. So trying to like find, because I don't think I ever came across anyone BookToking that was, apart from translated fiction, were the kind of books I read.
Yeah.
It's just like, how on earth would you otherwise filter that down and find the right person? Because it is that I used to work with someone who said you shouldn't do spray and pray marketing, which is just like ask anybody and throw it all out there. It needs to be specific or it just doesn't work. It's not, it's a waste of everyone's time, really.
Yeah. And also it takes a lot of time. Do you know what I mean? That's what the feedback, which I to be honest, I hadn't really anticipated it. But the fact that they said if there's any way you can speed up the process to find the right Booktokers, that's the bit that is just, because obviously if you say to a junior person, go and search on TikTokers because we want to find, YA, Booktokers who like YA, who talk about YA a lot, who might have at least 10,000 followers, who are based in the UK, it's just really hard to even be that kind of, because the search doesn't work like that. You don't go in and say, "Can I have UK people?" You obviously you get everyone then. So then how do you find the UK? Not everyone puts their geography on their thing. You know what I mean? And so yeah, it becomes really hard. So I'm sort of quietly excited by the sort of opportunity to help publishers find exactly the right BookTokers. But I suppose also ultimately, I'm like the big BookTokers who have thousands and millions and gazillions of likes and blah blah blah. They already have established relationships with the big publishers.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
obviously, if you have a big marketing budget and you can communicate with the big BookTokers and say, you know, we have this book coming out in a year, you know, can we have a little bit of a brainstorm about what content you could create? And then they pay them X thousand pounds. I have no idea what those numbers are, but they're big numbers. I'm not particularly interested in those people because they already have established relationships,
Yeah.
and I'm not also not that interested in the sort of like big ticket kind of things. I would rather serve the sort of mass kind of bit in between, and then help authors and publishers to really find, you know, there's a huge power in lots of book or influencers in general, lots of influencers who might have small numbers of followers but are really passionate. I'm much more interested in that ultimately than I am in those kind of big sort of influencers. I'm that's not my bag basically.
Yeah, and you know, we've seen all this kind of stuff before, right? I mean, like trends come in and out of publishing constantly, and it wasn't that long ago that YouTubers was the big word, and trying to find
Yeah,
the biggest YouTubers to market their books or to talk about their books or
yeah,
just to have it lying on a table in a video or something, you know, all this kind of silly stuff that obviously works, right? It
yeah,
does work, but obviously TikTok is just the new version of this.
yeah,
And I guess even before then, it was just trying to get the bloggers
yeah,
to mention it in their blog of the week or whatever, you know, but it's all about finding the audience. And I guess what I'm really interested in is finally these publishers aren't just treating it like a fad, right?
yeah,
And they're catching on that BookTok makes a massive difference in the industry. Obviously, we would see it in the bookshop on the front line, people saying, I saw all this on TikTok, have you got it? Right.
mm,
And I guess it starts there first, but
yeah,
then it filters back. And obviously, booksellers will order those books from publishers, wholesalers, wherever.
yeah,
Those books get a certain spike, and you see, you know, so many different, and it'll happen geographically as well. Obviously, in your cities, there's going to be a lot of younger people kind of rushing to their bookshops to try and get these books.
yeah, which is all good, isn't it? Yeah,
It's all great and it's really exciting. And I guess what I'm unsure about is the next step
yeah,
because it's, as you say, it's that first wave of a book coming out and then it drops like
yeah,
everything does.
yeah,
The machine turns over too quickly,
yeah,
and the space in the bookshop can only stay there for so long before it needs to move to a shelf or, you know, it'll be a customer order in 6 months' time.
yeah,
I mean, we've seen it in the awards, these books that maybe came out 2 years ago and actually suddenly they're right back there in the charts. I mean, what's your experience of kind of working on books or looking at books that were maybe 6 months old, 9 months old, and then suddenly they're big book talk favorites again?
yeah. I mean, I completely upfront have no idea why a book will suddenly resurface.
Yeah.
And I suspect most people don't know. I did speak to a publisher last week who is a non-fiction publisher, and they publish craft books. So basically, they publish craft books, and they had sent out not frontlist, but sent out a book about craft, which was this particular type of crocheting that they did these craft sets within their books. And they'd noticed this TikToker in a different country did loads of them and had quite a big following, sent them to them. Basically, this TikToker made content where they crocheted three peas in a pod. I mean, this is so specific. This is why I love TikToks about three peas in a pod. And it just went absolutely crazy. And they said, you know, basically, like on this sort of random backlist that they had just connected with the right person. And obviously they created this lovely, delightful little sort of TikTok about crocheting. You know, they sold thousands and thousands of copies of this very random book. So I think things happen as sort of kind of randomly as that. I think it can be sometimes driven from a publisher where they go, oh my God, like this TikToker loves the very niche of a niche that we operate in. why don't we send them a couple of our books? But then I think obviously also, I mean, this is a book that I actually just ordered from TikTok, which I don't know how old it is. It's a favorite book. Say it's 3 or 4 or 5 years old or whatever. Temporary, it's called. And that was basically, I obviously was scooting through TikTok, and a booktoker basically said, "Oh, one of the reasons why I loved studying English at university is because I read loads of random books that I really very rarely see, but like a couple of them really stuck in like my mind." And then she talked about that book, and it sounded so cool. I thought, "Oh, I'll just buy that." Now that obviously is not a frontlist book. No one else is really talking about it. So I think things can just take off because someone talks passionately and convincingly about a book they love, and it's we all know that's all it takes. Do you know what I mean? That's what we always have in book marketing or in the publishing industry talked about word of mouth. And it's like we know as in the book industry and booksellers in particular, it's like if you go in there, and obviously lots of people do ask for recommendations, which is, "Oh, I really love the last Ian Rankin, and I particularly like blah 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 about it." Like good booksellers, which obviously they all are, is they will be able to say, "Actually, these 3 books came out, or these 2 books came out this year, but actually there's a classic, a vintage classic crime that I think you'd really love as well."
Mhm.
And I just think that that is happening just at a much kind of bigger scale.
That's it. Because before it was like, I might go, "Oh, have you read this?" Because we read quite similar books, and it could be
Yeah.
a 5-year-old book, and James would buy it. Well, that's one person, and then
Yeah.
he might. But the scale is so much bigger now.
Yeah.
Like there was a Bookseller article about how Portobello Books
Yes, I saw that. Yeah.
pre-sold 3,000 books, which people think that's not lots. We all know that's
Yeah.
lots.
Yeah.
That is a lot of
Yeah,
pre-orders.
it's crazy
And
that,
I
isn't it?
haven't read it. I'm like, how? Which book? What? And
Yeah.
these are, and yeah, so it's the scale is just so much bigger now than me saying to you and then you saying to,
Yeah.
it's yeah.
Yeah, and I think as an industry, and I think we people who only ever work in the book industry, I think potentially take it for granted that we are blessed with millions of people who love what we produce, and in the main are happy to talk about it and communicate it to other people.
Mhm.
Just because they love it so much. So, if we worked in another industry where, we were trying to flog, something not quite as lovely as a book, you're not going to get millions of people going, "Oh, actually, I'd love to talk about this toilet brush holder that I found." You know what I mean? And I recommended it to 5 of my friends, and 3 of them bought. You know what I mean? It's just like we have books, and the beauty of it is, that they cater for every type of person with every type of interest. You know what I mean? It's like I'm sure, like we all do this. I think as book people, it's like whenever we meet someone, obviously, quite often people will say, "If you like, what have you read recently that you like?" Or they might, and I say, "Oh, what sort of things do you like?" Inevitably, I will recommend something, at least one thing, and we like doing that, and it's such a sort of a luxurious thing that the book industry has is millions of champions running around trying to keep what I mean, keep people buying books and
Yeah.
talking passionately about something they've read, which has really kind of affected them, etc., etc. So I think we're incredibly lucky. And I think BookTok is just an extension of it. I think it's just another place where we're incredibly lucky that people talk with such passion about things that we're trying to sell, basically.
Yeah, and I think we're just at that moment now where it's really being recognized as such a big tool. I mean, look at they do BookTok awards now, you
I
know.
know.
Yeah.
Well,
So
for the
this is
Booktokers or for the books that the Booktokers, I
for
don't really know.
well, for books and presumably for
For the
BookTokers too, but
Booktokers,
also
Yeah.
yeah.
for bookshops.
Yeah.
I had a great chat with Freya Blythe from Bookshop by the Sea in
Mm.
Aberystwyth
Yeah.
because she just won Bookshop of the Year
Yeah.
on BookTok.
Also as
Yeah.
voted for by,
Yeah. And they,
Yeah.
they were voting in their thousands.
wow.
Yeah. Oh my
And it
God,
was
completely.
just incredible. And like
Yes.
if you tried to convert that into like the nibbies,
Yeah.
and the kind of votes that you get for those books, it
No,
is just it's
completely.
astronomical. And like the
Yeah.
scale of it is just so hard to
What's interesting was that is the majority of those people wouldn't have been to that bookshop though.
yeah. So
Because
it's
so that it's about the work. I know what you were talking about there not being an aesthetic on TikTok, but there can be. And I
Oh,
have
it can
seen that
be. Yeah.
account and it's got a beautiful. It's
Yeah.
got I feel like that account has got a BookTok book lovers aesthetic. Like
Yeah.
it's the
100%.
dreamy kind
Yes.
of
Yeah,
setup,
Yeah.
and it works
It's a fantasy
brilliantly.
life, isn't it? That
It
I
is, yeah.
suspect a lot of booktokers want, basically, is, I sort of imagine, and obviously this is not me at all, of, like sort of escaping the city life, having this lovely lifestyle where you sell books, and obviously imaginary, like selling books and running a bookshop is a really easy, breezy thing to do. And then you meet some local fisherman, you know, who is sexy and comes. Do you know what I mean? I haven't thought about it a lot, but I'm imagining that that could be a
Wasn't there
sort
just a
of.
film? There was a Christmas film a bit like that. Was it Brooke Shields was in it? She's an
Oh,
author. And I
yes.
didn't watch it, and
Yeah,
she
she owned a
decides to go to
castle,
like
didn't
a
she?
Scottish castle and meets an angry laird and calms him down. But that's the kind of stuff
Yeah.
that's that escapism that
Oh my
maybe,
God.
especially now, I
Yes.
think people need, and maybe that's why BookTok works, because more than ever, do we all need to escape?
Yeah.
Like,
And
yeah.
also, romantasy is still a huge genre. I mean, actually, I have sort of looked at the sort of big genres that my booktokers have ticked, and romantasy is still huge, even though people are now starting to say, what is the next thing? Because it's not so, like, I saw a literary agent saying it's not quite so easy to place romantasy as it once was. Fantasy is still a huge thing, and YA is still I think the third biggest genre in terms of my sort of number of signed up, and then also spicy books that they call spicy books. So, and long may that thrive. Do you know what I mean? Because I suspect like that those perhaps some some of those genres underperformed before TikTok came along. So if it boots different genres higher up, I think, oh, great, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And then you get into that weird point of publishing where, you're working towards a trend, and then does that trend start to become saturated?
Yeah,
Like romantasy is everywhere,
yeah,
and you are tripping over it in bookshops, especially the big chains where they've got the space to
yeah,
then dedicate, three banks of fiction just
yeah,
for romantasy.
yeah.
And then you start thinking, well, is the quality up to scratch?
Yes, I think that's what booktokers, especially those who sort of have a kind of industry eye, they're sort of monitoring trends as well. So I definitely think that is what they are talking about. But I mean, I think that sort of copycat publishing has always happened anyway, hasn't it?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I mean, certainly if we go back to 50 Shades of Grey, the dreaded, is, there was at least half a dozen authors whose covers look the same, who roughly, do you know what I mean? It's like, of course, they just go like, wait a sec, they've sold how many million? Okay,
yeah.
even if we sell 100,000 in this space, I'm happy with that. So I think the copycat stuff definitely is still going on. And I think ultimately, trying to sort of, I mean, obviously trying to predict trends is quite difficult when publishing takes so long to actually publish a book. So, but also I think just in terms of sort of monitoring trends on TikTok, I mean, I think I don't know if this is an expression, but it's like trying to sort of pin the tail of a fish or something. Do you know what I mean? It's like it's not an expression, but I think it could be an expression. I just think we're never going to be able to do that. Do you know what I mean? And I think the more people sort of think, oh yes, we can like do certain searches and we can try and understand the algorithm. I just don't think it's going to happen. I think what will happen is booktokers will start talking about some other sort of, subgenre, kind of clash of two genres, and then that will slowly build momentum or quickly build momentum. I don't know. So
Mhm.
yeah, I'm not into predicting trends, and I think probably literary scouts and agents are much more adept at seeing ahead for things like that, because ultimately they do have to sell in their books, don't they, at the very earliest stage. So
Mhm.
I
yeah,
don't want to dwell too much on negativity in it, but I'm not using it at the minute, but I quite often see on threads people talking about BookTok and talking about
yeah.
BookTokers and controversy.
Mm,
And it makes me go, oh no, I want to, I mean, is there a place to it? I think it quite often can be, say, I don't know, if an author's if someone gives a bad review, or an
yeah,
author takes unkindly to a review, and then it
yeah.
all kind of kicks off, like any social media. Is it a big issue, or is it generally quite positive, the BookTok
I
community?
think I think there is at least one sort of book related controversy that is happening at any one time,
Mm.
like, and it's really taken off. Do you know what I mean? And
Yeah.
it could be, you know the latest one that just comes to mind is an author who kind of basically started selling her services, and she had sort of ripped off an idea from another author, blah 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 blah. And like everyone will have a view on it. You know what I mean? Everyone will have a view on it, and you will hear the views, and it will kind of spin out of control for a little bit. I must admit, unless I really have a specific interest, I tend not to comment. I keep all my controversy for Twitter, where I annoy everybody there, but I can't annoy everyone on every platform. However hard I try, I cannot do that. But so I think with TikTok, I mostly don't comment on things that are controversial. I would say it definitely has an element of that, but I think it's easy to avoid. I think also I would say it's more political than any other platform. So there's definitely an element of that. I would certainly say more BookTokers have talked about Palestinian authors on there, and have shared GoFundMe's and blah 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 than anywhere else by a long, 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 long way. So I think the nature of it is different. And if we were going to be conspiratorial about it, obviously who owns TikTok and who owns Twitter and who will shape what content is surfaced. There's no doubt about it that that's going on. So, yeah, I think there definitely is endless controversy. But to be honest, there always has been on Twitter as well, hasn't there? Do you know what I mean?
Well,
It's like,
is, yeah.
yeah, and it's like,
Yeah.
oh, that publisher did that. Well, that's not very cool, and I hate that because blah blah blah. And so it definitely is there. Well, I'm not denying it is there, but I would say in the main, it is mostly about people talking about the books that they love in a multitude of ways. And I think that's what's interesting about it. And funny, do you know what I mean? Funny and kind of silly. And I just think, yeah, we could all do with a bit of kind of lightness. So
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, staying with the lightness, I mean, looking ahead slightly, and I know, the publishing world is constantly shifting,
yeah,
and utilizing the tools at their disposal, and TikTok is becoming such a tool. And I
yeah,
think what you're doing with kind of linking authors and publishers and booktokers together is just the next chapter in this kind of machine. But I mean, where do you see the future of marketing going? Do you think it's going to be more social media driven than ever before? Do you feel like people are going to take BookTok to a different level, or is it going to be kept slightly separate from the sort of traditional, your I don't know, your typical marketing where you're still going
yeah,
to go on the tube in London and see posters of
yeah.
books? They're not
I
going to
mean,
get rid of that.
no. And I think those traditional marketing campaigns are done, even though I have to say, in the main, they don't excite me very much because even though there is creativity in their campaigns, sort of what they do, I find not very sort of interesting. So running Amazon ads, running Facebook ads, do you know what I mean? Are doing a sort of number of things which absolutely drives book sales and absolutely part of a really good integrated marketing campaign. I'm not particularly interested in that because fundamentally it's really hard and boring. To run campaigns because of how it works. So I'm not interested in that. But I obviously then you have the publicity side of things, which has changed because media has changed. So, once when we relied on all of those kind of gatekeepers and traditional previewers and reviewers who wrote for all the media, which, they're still all there, but they just don't hold as much weight.
Mhm.
Certainly with younger people, they still hold weight with a different type of demographic. So they have their place. So, even though I'm all for the new shiny, obviously those traditional marketing and publicity campaigns really work when they're done well. The issue is they're often not done well because they don't have enough resources put through them. So when I think about Big Five publishing, when you see a campaign done really well, and you see it, one big book, say every month, something like that, where they obviously, I consider them a big cruise liner. They've turned on all their engines and they're going, yes, like nothing will stop us from getting a bestseller because we have done everything. We've done every type of, retail point of sale marketing, all of our trade marketing. We've put ads everywhere for trade so that obviously booksellers are ordering it way ahead of time. We've ticked every publicity box. We've gone through every social media. We've got £5 gazillion to spend on paid for advertising in Amazon and blah, 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 and more and more and more and more and posters on the underground and blah, blah, blah. it's a beautiful thing because nothing will stop that becoming a big, but it's one book a
Mm.
month. Do you know
Yeah.
what I mean? So it's not that there's a problem with what they're doing. It's just they can't do it for everybody. So
Yeah.
everybody else is getting a sort of smattering of things.
Hmm.
And don't get me wrong, of course, sometimes a smattering of things will still take a book that's you're a bit surprised has suddenly become really popular. So lessons in chemistry is probably an example of that. So
Hmm.
um, lessons in chemistry, I suspect they kind of knew that it would do quite well. So and thought, okay, we'll give it a decent marketing budget. And then when they started seeing the reviews and started seeing the feedback, they sort of thought, actually, okay, let's allocate a bit more. Oh, it's going really well. Let's allocate a bit more. You know what I mean? So that can happen. You can have a surprise hit, or Eleanor Oliphant is another example of that published when I was at HarperCollins. It was kind of like, shit, everybody loves this book.
Hmm.
Like, brilliant. You know what I mean? Let's keep marketing it forever. And we, they sold 2.5 million copies. So, brilliant. But in the main, a lot of books will just sort of peter out. You know what I mean? And what's sort of sad about it, I think, is, and this is, I think, what authors don't understand when they enter into the industry. They have like fought, incredibly hard to get a literary agent. They have then this amazing thing has happened. They've got a book deal, which is like the most amazing thing ever. That process has taken them 2, 3, 4, 5 years to get to there. Then they know their book is going to come out in 18 months, and that's like the most exciting thing ever, blah, blah, blah. And then they kind of get there, and it's sort of like, oh, there's a lot of that. And
Yeah.
not be, and this is nothing about individuals in publishing not pulling their weight, far from it, but it's about the structure of publishing not serving everybody, and also publishing too many books. That's
I
also the other.
think, like, from a writer's point of view, when I was working in the bookshop, because it was the first, well, I worked many, many years ago when Ottakers was still a thing. I worked
Yeah.
there. But something that almost made me stop writing was when we had to send books back.
Hmm.
So I was like, "What do you mean?" And it was either you or Helen went, "Oh, well, take these hardbacks off," and off they go. And I was like, "Well, where?" And then the paperbacks, like, "Oh, well, what happens? Well, nobody might see that book." And I thought, what? What? But then obviously your book can't stay on the shelf forever.
No, no.
And I genuinely thought I might just not even, but I mean, I'm not trying to publish novels,
Yeah.
other things, but I thought, why bother? Why bother? And it is a
Yeah.
bit, but then there's the other side of it, where your books do stay on the shelf, and
Yes.
then
Yeah.
your book's been on the shelf, yeah.
But I mean, like just back briefly to what you just said, you go through the hardship of writing, which writing is hard enough, right?
Oh my God.
Let's
Yeah.
not say
Totally.
that it's
Yeah.
anything but then you finally get a publishing deal. And then it finally goes in the schedule, and then you're listed on the 10th of October, along with 1,900 other books, and you'll just get lost, right?
Yeah, completely. I know, and it is really disheartening. But the thing that I also always say to authors, which is, it is not about your first book. And that's really hard to hear when everything is geared towards your first book. And there are lots of authors who have had success with book 4, 5, 6, 7, if your publisher will keep you, until then. But, and they are nurtured. Certainly, I think that period where authors are nurtured has got shorter over time. But I still think, like authors now realize, and loads of authors that I talk to like sort of Dorothy Coomson or Jill Mansell or blah blah blah, they're like 15, 20, 25, 30 books into their career. And also just how the finances work, it's like then they start to get money that is sort of a reasonable amount. They're not, not like very few of these people are multimillionaires. That's certainly true. But you have to have a lot of books
Yeah.
do fairly well to start making a living in this industry. So it isn't based on your first book. If you're lucky enough to have a lessons in chemistry, that is like, you've been struck by lightning. Basically, it's not going to happen. Chances
Yeah.
are it's not going to happen. And I am certainly, in my work with the empowered author, any author that ever speaks to me, it's not that I don't want to crush their soul, but I absolutely do tell them the reality of it and how the industry works and how much resource is put into things, and that chances are it's not going to be what they expect. And the thing I think publishing sometimes doesn't cater for with authors is that authors have had this long lead in to get being published and blah blah blah. And they've also had all these kind of fantasy author things that are going to happen. Like they're going to have a big launch party. Their book's going to be in the window of a book, their local bookshop. Do you know what I mean? There are these authory things that they think this is what being an author is about. Do you know what I mean? And like if one or two of those things don't happen, or that they're going to get reviewed in the Times, or they don't understand why that hasn't happened to them, and there's like a sort of jolt of disappointment that I don't think publishers necessarily prepare them for, which is, this is the reality. If you are a genre author publishing your first book, this is the reality of what your experience is going to be like. I am all for just telling the absolute truth. This is how it's going to work. We're not going to tell you that we're going to sell millions of your book. We're not going to tell you we're going to have a massive launch on a sort of cruise liner, and and it's going to be amazing. We'll have celebrities out. Do you know what I mean? No, be truthful, and also talk about their careers, their long-term careers. The books that will come out in years to come, and that it needs stamina being one of those authors. It really does. Stamina to keep writing, but stamina to sort of cope with the emotional ups and downs of it. That's certainly the feedback that I get.
Yeah. I think, we'll keep coming back to that with quite a few people now, that there's two parts of being a writer. There's the writing, and then there's the selling the work.
Yeah.
And you've got to be
Absolutely.
prepared for both.
Yeah.
But we probably should wrap up, really. Although
Yes.
obviously we could touch on 1,000 things, but we like to think about, obviously we're thinking about the life cycle of a book and where all these different careers and roles fit. And we like to find out where people would go next, essentially, who you might talk to in this life cycle of a book that we maybe haven't thought about talking to.
Well, I think one of the things that I often speak to students who want to go into publishing. So again, sort of relative to what I've just said about an author's experience, not everybody who wants to go into publishing can work in Penguin Children's. Do you know what I mean? Like 90% of the students I meet sort of, oh yeah, I love Penguin, I want to work there, blah, blah, blah. And obviously I'm sure it's a gorgeous place to work and it's delightful. Obviously they can't do that. So actually one of the things, so I talk about all the different types of jobs there are, but also go and work with self-published authors, find self-published authors and learn how to publish with them. That would be my advice to it. Is like, offer your services. So if you're good at marketing, go to self-published authors and say like, okay, you've got your book up on Kindle. Obviously, I realize that you're like a one woman or one man band. You don't really have the capacity to marketing. Shall we talk about how I could help support your marketing and get those practical skills? It's a bit like, where do you learn more? Do you learn more from working in a small company where everyone has to do a little bit of everything? That's what a self-published author is. A self-published author is a micro publishing company because they do everything. So better to work and learn a little bit of everything and then turn up at publishing, because actually if you go and work in publishing, you might have one tiny little bit of the publishing process that you have to do repetitively every day, which might not be that interesting, and you might not actually learn that much for a long time. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I would say, look to, certainly authors that you can help and learn how the publishing, or indeed publish something yourself. You know what I mean? Write some poetry and see how you can get it up onto Kindle Direct Publishing or other platforms, and work out how you could potentially create a little audience for yourself. Learn how to do it. I'm all for people being really practical, because what I think is, I love how practical and effective young people are, because they just go away and they use all these tools, TikTok or whatever, and they use them really effectively, and they start creating audiences. And certainly when I worked in publishing, I was like, God, like some of the conversations I had in big publishing, I'd be like, I know booktokers that know, not booktokers, but book bloggers that know more than you lot. Literally, like they know more, and they're more kind of like closer to readers, and they're closer to authors than you lot ever are. You've distanced yourself so much. You don't, you know what I mean? And so I think actually having more people who are really close to everything is much more useful. Basically, I'm all for that.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting. I mean, we've spoken to a few authors now, actually, I guess, and it's just interesting to hear how everybody's journey is different, right? And it doesn't matter what size or what your background is. And we've spoken to small press publishers as well, where it might be one person and they do everything.
Exactly.
And it's just fascinating to see that, yes, but their books still hit the shelf.
Yeah, no, completely. And do you know what? That is hard work. That is hard work. Running an indie press, And I don't know if you know Kevin at Blue Moose, but he is my sort of like when I think of how indie presses can work,
Mhm.
he is that person. And when I sort of say to him, like, how have you had so much success, blah, 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 and he is like, I hand sell my books into independent booksellers like over and over and over again. And I have relationships with them. And basically it now has to a point where, if Kevin now rings up and says, oh, I've got a new book coming up, blah, blah, they listen because they know he publishes great books. You know what I
We
mean?
hand
So
sold a lot of Leonard and Hungry Paul when we worked at the bookshop.
amazing.
Yeah.
Isn't that the best book?
Yeah.
Yeah. And it
Yeah.
just goes, when somebody like Kevin sends you an email and says you need to pay attention to this, you just know, don't you? You're
Yeah,
just like, all right, okay.
exactly.
It's either gonna crush me or it's gonna lift me up and it's
Yeah,
gonna improve my life,
yeah.
It's
But
it's that kind of
but to
that kind
get
of
to that
control.
probably took him 5+ years. Do
Exactly.
you know what I mean?
Yeah.
There's no there are no quick wins in publishing. That's also the other thing that I end up saying over and over again. Nothing happens quickly. And so yeah, I think we always have to have that in mind, don't we? But yeah, all of those different roles, and I really have huge admiration for indie presses because I think also how hard that is, what Kevin does, but also the sort of economics of it are really difficult, really, really challenging, basically.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, that the more we talk to people and the more kind of these sort of mini series we're kind of doing them in sixes, I suppose. We're going to start going back in circles and maybe not revisiting the same people, but certainly going back and talking to different people on a similar level and seeing how
Yeah.
they do it. Because you're absolutely right. The more on that level we talk, the more we'll learn.
Absolutely. God. And do you know what? I think it's like if you have that sort of like mentality of learning, it's like the first guy that I worked for in a small magazine publishing company, and I always think this because it's very disconnected from when I then worked in a HarperCollins, is so I think we had 8 people working on these magazines, very boring magazines, but anyway, by the by. And he said, I want every person in here to be able to answer the phone and answer whatever question they have intelligently. So what that meant is you had to learn about every bit of the business. So they might ring up and ask about advertising. They might ring up and say, oh, my copy is not turned up. Could you find out? So you'd have to know like the customer service bit of it. And I actually just think that's such a good sort of professional kind of thing to have in mind, is to learn everything about a business. Whereas in HarperCollins, if a phone was ringing in the distance, you know what I mean? You'd just be like, oh, who cares? You know what I mean? I don't care about that.
Yeah.
And or you'd pick it up and be like, who? What?
Yeah.
John? No, I don't know John. Do you know what I mean? Like, not a great kind of advocate for the business, ultimately, the sort of telephone. Luckily, people don't use telephones anymore, thank God. But the principle is the same, which is, my personal view is you have to be endlessly curious because the more you learn about the different aspects of the industry, and I think certainly as someone who has a sort of creative kind of entrepreneurial sort of mind, it's like, they obviously, people always say, like, when you're creating something new, it's like, what problem are you solving? And publishing has millions of either little problems or large problems that could be solved creatively, either through the use of technology or through the use of using human resources differently. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. So I could go on and on and on about that because and I think basically if you go into a publishing company and you're young and you think, God, this doesn't make any sense how they do this. This is really ineffective, blah, blah, blah. You're right. It's really ineffective. And don't think because you've turned up at a big 5 publisher, they're not being ineffective about stuff. They really have got millions of different Excel spreadsheets dotted around the business that don't speak to each other and blah. Do you know what I mean? It's like, so don't think, oh, this must be the way everyone does it. It's like, always interrogate how things are done and come up with alternatives. Be that annoying person like me and then get made redundant after 3 years.
I love it.
Sam, I know that we could do this for another hour, but we're probably at a good point.
Yes, I'm sorry, I am a natterer.
No,
not
same.
at all. It's really interesting. It is really interesting. And I think the knowledge that you're bringing from publishing and working with authors and working in the kind of big machine will only do your new BookTok family justice, I think.
I hope so. Yeah. Well, I try to be as sort of, expansive as possible. That's not the word, but I am a sort of, I'm now considering myself a bit of a mother hen figure. Do you know what I mean? I try to pull people towards me and I try and help people as much as possible. But, so I'm into helping people, informing people, empowering them if I possibly can. And yeah, and obviously, hopefully everybody rises together. That's my sort of philosophy.
Thanks so much for listening. We hope you learned something new like we always do.
Follow us on Instagram and subscribe to our Substack to be the first to hear more.
And you can find us in all the places you usually find your podcasts.
Until next time, keep reading.